Irrespective of President Obama's pro-Palestinian and pro-Muslim policies, the number of terrorist cells in the U.S. increases annually, as do the Islamic terrorist attacks on the U.S. mainland, such as in San Bernardino 2015, Boston 2013, Times Square 2010, Fort Hood, Texas 2009, Little Rock 2009, Dallas 2009, etc. In 1983, while President Reagan pressured Israel to stop the hot pursuit of Arafat, Islamic car bombs blew up the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, murdering 300 U.S. Marines. In 1998 and in 2000, while President Clinton pressured Israel to expand concessions to the Palestinians and made Arafat a frequent foreign visitor to the White House, Islamic car bombs hit the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, murdering 300 persons, and Islamic terrorists hit the USS Cole at the port of Aden, murdering 17 U.S. sailors. September 11 was planned while President Clinton pressured Israel to repartition Jerusalem and retreat to the pre-1967 lines. President Obama was right when declared at Cairo University that Islam has always been part of America's story, and indeed, Islamic terrorism targeted U.S. ships between 1776 and the beginning of the 19th century. John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the USA, who researched the causes of anti-Western Islamic terrorism, concluded that its core cause was endemic hostility towards the infidel. The U.S. is the role model of democracy and civil liberties. Therefore, the U.S. is perceived as a lethal threat by repressive, rogue Muslim regimes which have terrorized their own people and other Muslim communities since the 7th century. The U.S. is perceived by rogue Muslims, organizations, and regimes as the most effective obstacle on their way to regional and global domination. The U.S. prominence has made it the chief scapegoat, blamed by rogue Muslim regimes for their own social, economic, and moral failures. Islamic terrorists believe that their victory in Afghanistan over the Soviet military caused the disintegration of the USSR. They are convinced that defeating the USA would be easier. In view of the U.S. retreat from Vietnam 1973, Iran 1979, Lebanon 1983, Somalia 1993, Libya 2012, and the expected evacuation of Iraq and Afghanistan. Islamic terrorists assume that intensified anti-U.S. terrorism, increasingly on the U.S. mainland, triggers further U.S. concessions. Islamic terrorists have been emboldened by U.S. policymakers who claim, in defiance of 1400 years of Islamic terrorism, Islamic tyranny, and the absence of intra-Muslim peaceful coexistence, that Islam has always been part of the American story, that there is no Islamic terrorism since Islam supposedly promotes peace, that there is no jihadist terrorism since jihad ostensibly purifies the soul, that the U.S. should engage rogue regimes diplomatically rather than militarily, that Muslim Brotherhood, the largest transnational Islamic terrorist organization, is not a terrorist organization, that there is no military solution to terrorism, that terrorism should be contained rather than defeated, and that terrorism is largely a law enforcement challenge rather than a military issue. Thus, wrong U.S. assumptions have produced wrong U.S. policies and failed battle tactics. According to the late Professor Fuad Ajami, one of the leading Middle East scientists in recent years, it is a false reading of Islam to say that terror springs from the impasse between Israelis and Palestinians. No U.S. diplomatic scheme would spare America the fury of those bent upon eradicating its presence in the Middle East. Ajami attributes much of the contemporary Islamic terrorism to the teachings of Sayyid Qutb, one of the founding fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood, which considers the US a moral threat to Muslims. Is it realistic to assume that rogue Muslim regimes, which have employed terrorism since the 7th century in order to settle intra-Muslim conflicts with fellow believers, would not employ terrorism in order to settle their conflicts with the USA, the big, arrogant, infidel Satan? Islamic terrorism constitutes a clear and present danger to the US and to the free world, irrespective of the Arab-Israeli conflict, independent of the Palestinian issue, and regardless of Israel's policies or even the very existence of the Jewish state, which is the little Satan as far as Muslim terrorists are concerned.